rods snapping mid-hook set, reels giving up the ghost under moderate drag. Over 3,000 gear failure reports flooding Australian angling forums in a single year. This is the reality for fishhoes who trusted the country's largest outdoor retail chains with their most critical gear. Big box retailers like BCF and Anaconda helped push independent tackle shops from over 4,500 stores to fewer than 2,200 nationwide. Today, nearly 70% of what fills those shelves is private label product. And in 2026, big box fishing tackle sales dropped 7%. To understand why millions of Aussie anglers stopped buying, you first have to understand what made them start in the first place. Back in the mid-1990s, a new kind of fishing store started appearing across Australia's suburban landscape. Unlike the cluttered aisles and musty shelves of the old tackle shops that serious fishhoes had grown up with, the kind of places where the bloke behind the counter knew your name and could tell you exactly what the bream were hitting on in the local estuary, these new stores were something else entirely. BCF, which stands for boating, camping, fishing, launched its first dedicated superstore format in Queensland and rapidly expanded down the eastern seaboard. The stores were enormous, wide aisles, bright lighting, gear for every species from coral trout to murray cod, and price tags that made you feel like you were getting a bargain. For weekend warriors and first-time anglers alike, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. The strategy was dead simple: offer everything under one roof, cut prices through volume, and make the shopping experience part of the whole outdoors lifestyle. Saturday Arvo road trips now included a stop at BCF, where families spent hours testing rods on in-store casting stations, flicking through lure walls, and chatting to staff in branded polos who seemed to know their stuff. For anglers used to specialty shops with limited stock and unpredictable hours, the convenience was hard to argue with. Store layouts emphasized broad aisles, massive product displays, and branded sections promising expertise and authority. Behind the scenes, the supply chain was built for scale. Centralized warehousing and bulk contracts with major manufacturers gave the chains leverage to negotiate lower costs, which flowed directly onto the sales floor. The early stores featured both national brands and the first wave of private label gear, often at prices that undercut the local tackle shop by 10 to 20%. This combination of selection, spectacle, and savings drew in both beginners and lifelong fishhoes, fueling a rapid geographic expansion along Australia's coastline and into regional centres. By the end of the decade, BCF's model had proven itself. The chain's growth outpaced traditional tackle shops, which simply couldn't match the convenience and pricing power of the big box format. What had started as a handful of Queensland stores had become a national phenomenon, fundamentally reshaping the way millions of Australians bought their fishing gear. Anaconda entered the picture as a competing outdoor superstore, focusing on camping, adventure, and fishing across its sprawling outlets. Together, BCF and Anaconda carved up the market, and the era of the independent tackle shop was, for many towns, well and truly over. The national reach of Australia's big box fishing retailers accelerated sharply through the 2000s. Super Retail Group, which owns BCF, made a series of strategic acquisitions, absorbing smaller regional chains and dramatically expanding its store count. By 2010, BCF had launched a fully integrated e-commerce platform, extending its reach beyond the major cities and allowing anglers in regional Queensland, the NT, and rural WA to browse the same vast catalogue of gear from their phones. The next leap came with the opening of BCF's flagship destination stores in major population centres, sprawling complexes that blended retail, entertainment, and education under one roof. These megastores, featuring in-store casting ponds, live bait displays, and full-service knowledgeable staff demonstrations, drew visitors from across entire regions. They positioned BCF not just as a shop, but as a cultural touchstone for the Australian outdoor lifestyle. Meanwhile, independent tackle shops continued to vanish. According to industry surveys, the shop count dropped from around 4,500 in the early 1990s to just under 2,200 by 2023. The convenience and scale of the big box model, combined with aggressive pricing and massive inventory, made it increasingly difficult for smaller retailers to survive. Regional variation persisted. Some boutique shops held out in coastal fishing communities and specialist markets catering to fly fishing or game fishing. But the overall trend was unmistakable. In recent years, further consolidation has cemented the dominance of the megastore format. The combined entities now operate hundreds of locations across Australia, with unified logistics and a single purchasing arm capable of negotiating unprecedented volume discounts from overseas manufacturers. This ensured that for most Australian anglers, from Darwin to Hobart, the local tackle shop had been replaced by a national retail giant. The era of regional variety and hands-on expertise gave way to a standardized, branded experience on a scale the industry had never seen. Walking into a BCF or Anaconda in 2026, most anglers are met with a sense of assurance. The wide aisles are lined with hundreds of rods, reels, and lures, each displayed under bright lights and wrapped in packaging stamped with phrases like Pro Series or Tournament Grade. For many shoppers, the sheer scale and polish of these displays signals reliability. A national survey conducted last year found that 68% of Australian anglers trust the quality of gear purchased at big box outdoor retailers, a figure that climbs even higher among first-time buyers. Price points reinforce this perception. A mid-range spinning combo, for example, often retails between $49 and $69 Australian dollars, sitting squarely in the comfort zone for hobbyists looking for value without blowing the budget. Store signage highlights savings and exclusive deals, while staff in branded shirts offer advice on matching gear to local conditions, whether that's targeting barramundi in the top end, chasing yellowfin bream along the NSW coastline, or working soft plastics over the kelp beds in South Australia. The variety is staggering. A single aisle might feature over 300 different SKUs, yet most share the same handful of house brands. Industry data from 2026 shows that nearly 70% of the fishing gear on these shelves carries a private label badge, a ratio that has steadily increased over the past decade. Labels like Jarvis Walker or various BCF house brands dominate shelf space, often sitting alongside or even replacing well-known international names that once defined quality in Australian tackle shops. For the average shopper, these cues, brand names, price tags, and the volume of choice create a sense that quality is a given. The logic seems straightforward. A retailer with national reach, professional displays, and competitive pricing must surely be delivering on its promise. But as more experienced phishos have discovered, the story behind the label can be far more complicated than the packaging suggests. Inside the materials testing lab at a major Australian university, Dr. Sarah Nguyen lines up two fishing rods, nearly identical at first glance, but worlds apart on the inside. She points out that the graphite blank on the left costs $2.50 per kilogram to manufacture, while the one on the right was sourced for $1.50. That single dollar difference, she explains, doesn't just trim the price tag. It means a 12% drop in stiffness, confirmed by independent flex tests conducted on private label rods sold after 2022. The lower-cost graphite, now standard for many mid-range private label models sold in Australian chain stores, contains more filler and fewer high-strength fibers. The result is a blank that flexes more under load and recovers less crisply after a cast, which, if you're flicking a 3-inch soft plastic lure into tight structure around a Queensland estuary, can mean the difference between a hookup and a miss. Nearly half, 48%, of the rod blanks on BCF shelves in 2026 originate from Vietnamese factories. These plants ramped up production as labor costs in China climbed, but the shift came with trade-offs. Dr. Nguyen's team measured up to 15% variation in casting distance between rods carrying the same SKU, the same product code, the same box, supposedly the same rod. The cause? Inconsistent material batches and minimal functional testing at the factory level. Most quality checks rely on visual inspection and basic dimensional gauges, not the kind of stress testing that reveals subtle weaknesses in the blank. For the angler, these invisible compromises play out on the water. A rod that feels lively in the aisle might lose power after a season of chasing jacks up north, or snap under the load of a solid Murray cod on a deep water jig. The savings at the register are real. But so is the risk. Lost fish, ruined sessions on the water, and the creeping doubt that what's on the label no longer matches what's inside. Dr. Nguyen's findings set the stage for a deeper look at how supply chain decisions ripple out from the factory floor to the heart of every Australian fishing trip. A fishing rod on the shelf at your local BCF may have crossed borders multiple times before reaching the store. Production often starts in China, where graphite or fiberglass is sourced, then moves to Vietnam for shaping, and on to Indonesia or Bangladesh for final assembly and packaging. The paperwork that follows, a Certificate of Conformity, or COC, rarely covers more than basic specs or a visual check. Industry insiders say the COC is often a rubber stamp signed without real testing. This opens the door to wide variability even within the same model number. Mark Johnson, who has spent 20 years in outdoor retail supply chains, including a decade working with Australian distributors, points to the standard swap clause buried in most contracts. Manufacturers can substitute up to 20% of components or materials, provided the rod passes a basic inspection. So too rods labeled Pro Series might have different internal materials depending on the production batch, the week of manufacture, or even the shift that ran the line. Quality control typically stops at checking that blanks are straight and guides are properly attached. There is almost no stress testing for flex or durability before shipping. At the retailer's warehouse, whether that's BCF Distribution Centre in Brisbane or Anaconda's Logistics Hub in Melbourne, checks focus on packaging and barcodes, not performance. The result? Rods and reels can meet every single paperwork requirement, pass every documented checkpoint, and still fail catastrophically on the water, leaving Australian anglers with unpredictable gear and broken promises. The bloke who drove 3 hours to fish a remote Northern Territory billabong for barramundi doesn't want to find out his reels drag has given up when a metre-long barra is peeling line off the spool. Rod packaging in 2026 is plastered with phrases like premium graphite, tournament grade, and professional series. Yet these terms have no enforceable industry standard in Australia. Catalogues and shelf tags use language that strongly suggests high performance, but independent lab tests tell a different story. For example, rods labelled as premium graphite can be built with graphite blends that vary wildly in quality. Independent flex tests on private label rods sold after 2022 measured a 12% variance in blank stiffness, enough to meaningfully change how a rod loads and casts, even among units carrying the same model number. Buy 2 rods off the same hook on the same day, and you might end up with noticeably different tools. This discrepancy is not limited to rods. Lures marked as precision weight showed up to 15% deviation in laboratory studies, affecting casting accuracy and hook set reliability. If you're trying to work a surface lure along a structure edge for big flathead, that kind of inconsistency matters enormously. Marketing copy often lists features like Pro Action Taper or engineered for tournament use, but these claims are rarely backed by transparent, independently verifiable data. The term premium may refer to little more than a mid-grade graphite mixed with fillers, while tournament is a label applied across a wide price range regardless of actual field performance. In Australia, where the Australian consumer law does provide some protections against misleading claims, these marketing practices occupy a grey zone that most consumers simply don't have the time or expertise to challenge. In practice, an angler might buy 2 identically labelled rods from BCF, only to find that one flexes noticeably more than the other and delivers a shorter cast. These gaps between catalogue promise and lab measurement erode trust, and they leave Australian fishers questioning whether the gear on the shelf actually matches the reliability its packaging implies. On a humid January morning in early 2025, Jake Thompson set out from his tinny before sunrise on Lake Eildon in Victoria, hoping for a shot at a quality redfin or maybe a surprise yellow belly. The rod in his hand was a 7-foot Pro Series graphite model he'd picked up from his local BCF just a fortnight earlier. As he worked a hard-body lure along a submerged timber edge, a heavy strike bent the rod deep. The next moment, a sharp crack echoed across the still water. The blank snapped clean near the butt, leaving Jake holding a useless stump while the fish thrashed and vanished into the depth. Later, a video of the incident circulated on Australian fishing forums and the Fish Raider community board, showing the break in slow motion. The rod's packaging had promised tournament-grade performance. The reality was a lost fish, a ruined morning on the water, and an $89 replacement cost, not counting the petrol and the early alarm. Jake's post attracted dozens of responses from anglers sharing almost identical experiences with the same model. Sarah Mitchell's story followed a similar path, though has played out in far more demanding conditions. In the autumn of 2022, she upgraded to a tournament-grade X500 spinning reel, drawn in by claims of saltwater toughness and silky smooth drag, exactly what you need when you're targeting queenfish and trevally around the remote Kimberley coast of Western Australia. On a charter out of Broome, her first reel test came against a fast-running queenfish that bolted for deep water the moment it felt the hook. 15 minutes into the fight, the reel's drag gave out completely. The line went slack, the fish was gone, and Sarah was left cranking a handle that spun without resistance. Later inspection back at the charter base revealed scorched drag washers and plastic gear teeth stripped bare, signs of a reel that simply wasn't built for the application its packaging had specifically advertised. The captain's log for that trip noted the failure. The replacement reel purchased at the nearest tackle shop lasted less than a season before showing identical symptoms. For both Jake and Sarah, the disappointment wasn't just about broken gear. It was the realization that the packaging and the brand reputation didn't match the equipment's real-world performance in Australian conditions. These aren't gentle, forgiving environments. Australian fishing, whether that's a barra session in the tropical north, a surf casting session on the South Australian coast, or working big bass plastics in a Victorian highland reservoir, demands gear that actually does what it says on the tin. Each failure came with a cost: lost fish, wasted time, wasted money, and the deep sense that the promise of reliability had become just another part of the marketing. These moments on the water brought the issue into sharp focus, raising uncomfortable questions about what Australian anglers are actually getting for their money. In mid-2024, a charter crew fishing offshore from Cairns in far north Queensland recorded the exact moment a tournament-grade spinning reel lost its drag under the steady pull of a decent Spanish mackerel. The captain's log listed the failure at just over 12 minutes into the fight. When the reel was later bench-tested by a member of the Fishing World magazine team, it registered a 23% drop in holding power compared to a specialist shop model at a similar price point. The replacement cost, around $25 for the reel parts plus a lost day's catch in the Coral Sea, was only the beginning of the story. Within weeks, the incident had become a talking point across every major Australian fishing platform. FishRadar, Ausfish, BCF's own community pages, and the sprawling Facebook groups that now serve as the digital campfire for Aussie fishhoes. Analytics from Australian Fishing Forum monitoring tools show over 3,200 posts about reel drag and rod blank failures in the 12 months that followed, with users trading advice on everything from warranty claims at BCF to DIY drag washer replacements using aftermarket parts. Many threads linked back to private label models sold at national chains, particularly those marketed as tournament grade or pro series. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Emma Chen, a data analyst and passionate recreational angler from Sydney, began systematically tracking these complaints. Her spreadsheet mapped out failure clusters by SKU, production lot, and purchase date. Patterns emerged: spikes in failures after certain overseas production runs, a strong correlation between lower-cost models and higher rates of drag failure or blank breakage, and a geographic pattern that suggested certain batches had made their way to stores along the Queensland coast and in the NT before the problems became known. Dave Reed, who runs a specialist tackle shop in Noosa on Queensland's Sunshine Coast, noticed a change in his own sales numbers almost immediately. Customers who once would have replaced failed gear at BCF started coming into his shop asking for side-by-side drag tests and wanting to understand exactly where their gear was manufactured and how it had been tested. Reed's records show a 17% increase in sales of premium reels and rods since 2024, mostly to anglers who specifically cited reliability as their number one concern, often mentioning a recent failure at a big box chain. Nielsen's 2026 retail audit puts hard numbers to the trend. National sales of premium rods and reels at large Australian chains fell by 7% over 2 years, even as overall fishing participation held steady, and even increased slightly, boosted by the post-pandemic surge in outdoor recreation that saw thousands of Australians get into fishing for the first time. The ripple effect is clear. Every gear failure that circulates online, every busted rod story shared at the boat ramp, every reel that gives up on a screaming barra chips away a little more at the perception of value. For many experienced anglers, the hidden costs, lost fish, wasted trips, the price of replacement, now outweigh the promise of savings at the register. Mick Harris, a longtime tackle shop owner in Townsville, has watched the shift in angler behaviour play out right in front of him over the past 2 years. Instead of relying on packaging claims or store brand reputation, more customers now ask to actually test rods before committing to a purchase. On a typical afternoon, Mick sets up a flex testing rig in the back corner of his shop. Nothing flash, just a 120-kilogram test bench that lets buyers feel for themselves the difference between blanks that load and recover crisply and those that wobble, feel dead in the hand, or show uneven action along their length. This hands-on approach stands in sharp contrast to the big box experience, where inspection is limited to what you can see through shrink wrap and read on a glossy label. A recent survey of experienced Australian anglers revealed a 48% increase in buyer confidence after performing simple in-store tests, checking guide alignment, feeling for blank consistency, and testing reel drag under measured load. These steps take only a few minutes, but they can reveal flaws that would otherwise go completely unnoticed until a critical moment out on the water. Mick encourages customers to bring their own reels and line, setting up side-by-side comparisons between shop stock brands and the mass market models they might have been considering at BCF. The goal isn't to upsell, it's to restore a sense of trust that has been quietly eroded with each failed cast, each broken blank, each drag that gave up when a big fish needed stopping. For many fishhoes, the simple act of inspecting gear in person, feeling the weight, the flex, the smoothness of the drag, the quality of the guides, has become a form of insurance against the disappointment they've come to expect from the big chains. It's a practical response to years of accumulated frustration, and it's quietly changing the way serious Australian anglers approach every single purchase. Rather than accepting the promise on the box at face value, they're relying on their own hands and eyes, rebuilding confidence one rod and reel at a time. There's something deeply familiar about this shift, if you think about it. It's a return to exactly what the old tackle shops used to offer before the big box era swept them away. Expert advice, the ability to hold and feel the gear, honest conversations about what works in local conditions, and a relationship with a retailer who actually cares whether you catch fish. Fishing is woven into the fabric of Australian life in a way that's hard to overstate. We are a nation built around coastlines, rivers, and reef systems of extraordinary richness. From the barramundi billabongs of the Northern Territory and Queensland's Gulf Country, to the snapper grounds of South Australia, the trout streams of Tasmania's Central Highlands, and the kingfish and yellowtail reefs along the NSW South Coast, fishing isn't just a recreational activity for millions of Australians. It's a cultural inheritance, a form of meditation, a reason to get up before the sun, and one of the most reliable ways to connect with the vast, wild country that surrounds us. When gear fails in these environments, the consequences aren't just financial. A blown drag on the Great Barrier Reef when a coral trout hits the lure and bolts for the nearest bommy isn't just about losing a fish. It's about losing a moment that took months to plan, thousands of dollars to reach, and a lifetime to appreciate. A snapped rod blank on a Murray cod session, one of the most iconic freshwater fishing experiences in the Southern Hemisphere, doesn't just ruin the outing. It undermines the entire ritual. This is why the shift in angler behavior matters beyond simple consumer economics. When experienced fishers abandon the big box chains and return to specialist retailers, they're not just chasing better gear. They're reclaiming something that the consolidation of retail nearly erased, the idea that the person selling you fishing tackle actually understands what you're trying to do with it, has probably stood on the same bank or drifted over the same reef, and genuinely wants your session to succeed. The remaining independent tackle shops in Australia, and there are still some brilliant ones, scattered from Cairns to Coffs Harbour, from Esperance to Darwin, represent something that can't be replicated by a national chain: local knowledge, honest product curation, and a vested interest in the health of the local fishery. Many of the best ones have survived precisely because they refuse to compete on price alone, choosing instead to compete on expertise, service, and the kind of trust that only comes from years of shared experience on the water. The question now is whether the broader market will follow. Industry analysts tracking the 2026 data suggest the trend is real and accelerating. Premium rod and reel sales at independent retailers are up. Online communities dedicated to gear testing and transparency are growing. A new generation of Australian anglers, savvier, more research-driven, and deeply connected through social media, is increasingly willing to spend more for gear they can actually trust. So where does this leave the average Australian angler standing in the BCF aisle, budget in hand, trying to work out whether the $59 rod combo is worth the risk or whether the $149 specialist shop option is actually worth the extra $100? The answer, unfortunately, isn't simple, but there are some practical steps that can dramatically reduce the chances of ending up with a rod in your hand that doesn't survive its first season. First, wherever possible, actually handle the gear before you buy it. Flex the blank along its length and check that the action feels consistent and progressive. Look at the guide wraps under decent light. Loose threads, bubbles in the epoxy, or guides that aren't perfectly aligned are red flags. Check that the reel seat is firm and the blank doesn't feel hollow or dead when you tap it. Second, ask questions. If you're buying from a specialist shop, ask where the blank is made and whether the shop has had any issues with that particular model. A retailer who knows their stock and is confident in it will answer without hesitation. One who gets evasive or dismissive is telling you something important. Third, do your research online before you buy. The Australian Fishing Forum community is extraordinarily active and brutally honest. A quick search on Aussie, FishRadar, or the relevant Facebook groups for your species or region will often reveal within minutes whether other anglers have had problems with a particular model. The failure patterns that Emma Chen documented in her spreadsheet don't stay secret for long in the digital age. Fourth, consider the real cost. A rod that costs $59 and needs replacing after one season costs more in the long run than a $149 option that lasts 5 years and never lets you down when it matters. Factor in the lost fish, the ruined sessions, and the frustration, and the maths often shifts decisively in favor of buying quality once rather than cheap twice. Fifth, support your local specialist if you have one. The independent tackle shops that survived the big box wave did so for a reason. They offer something the national chains simply cannot replicate. Every sale you make there helps keep that local knowledge and expertise alive and accessible for the next generation of anglers. Today, Australian anglers are weighing the cost of convenience against the risk of unreliable gear, and for many, that calculation has fundamentally changed. Because one failed component doesn't just mean money lost. It means a story you can't tell, a fish you never landed, a morning on the water that turned into a disappointment instead of a memory. As mass production and slick branding continue to outpace real quality control, trust erodes at the water's edge. The fishing rod, the reel, the lure, these aren't just products. They are the instruments through which we engage with some of the most extraordinary aquatic environments on the planet. They deserve to be treated accordingly. For Aussie Fishers, the real price isn't on the tag. It's in every cast that counts, every session that matters, every moment when the gear is all that stands between you and the fish of a lifetime. The lesson is simple, and it's one that the independent tackle shops have always known. Reliability is earned. It's built in honest manufacturing, verified through real testing, and proven on the water. It cannot be packaged. It cannot be branded. And it cannot be faked. The big box era promised everything. What it too often delivered was just enough to get you back to the shop for a replacement. But that era, it seems, is quietly coming to an end. One broken rod at a time. One failed reel at a time. One honest conversation at the tackle shop at a time. Share your own experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories from the water.